During the last World War, Nazi Germany achieved such outstanding success in creating weapons that the rest of the world could barely stop it. Ballistic and cruise missiles, nerve paralytic gases, anti-tank systems, guided aerial bombs, jet aircraft in mass production. This list could go on forever. But the Germans were never able to create the main weapon capable of changing the strategic balance, or rather, they simply didn't have enough time. I'm talking about the atomic bomb. Hitler had his own nuclear program, and the Germans actually achieved quite good results with it. However, fortunately, they didn't have enough time or resources to create their own nuclear bomb. Otherwise, the outcome of World War II would most likely have been different, and we would be living in a completely different world now. This episode will be dedicated to alternative history. We'll discuss what would have happened if the Nazis had actually obtained nuclear weapons. You will also learn how a hypothetical German atomic bomb would have affected the course of World War II and its outcomes. And of course, I'll tell you about Hitler's real nuclear program and why it ended in failure. Failure. My name is Semyon, and I declare the what if section open. Let's begin. Failure. Who deprived Hitler of the atomic bomb? In the 1930s, Germany was rightfully considered a leader in the field of atomic physics. Therefore, it's not surprising that by the start of the World War, the Germans were closer than anyone else to creating nuclear weapons. However, despite having a decent head start, by the middle of the war, the Germans were already hopelessly losing the atomic race. And they had no chance of catching up with the Americans. Why did this happen? Who took the nuclear bomb away from Hitler? There are several explanations for this. Each one is supported by its own group of interested parties. For example, the first version is quite popular in the West. It says that the project to create German nuclear weapons was thwarted by brave British paratroopers and local anti-fascists who destroyed the heavy water plant in Norway. This fact did actually take place. The British carried out a whole series of sabotage operations and eventually blew up the facility. But it was hardly critical for the German nuclear program. Many modern researchers doubt this version. But in Anglo-American literature, the sabotage of the Norwegian factory is called the main reason for the collapse of the German nuclear project. And again, everything is beautiful and in the spirit of Hollywood. Combat paratroopers, shootouts, explosions. Another version was born in post-war Germany. German scientists began to say that all the previous years they had been sabotaging as much as they could. They were documenting the orders of the criminal Hitler regime, and instead of working on the bomb, they were actually engaged in sabotage. Supposedly deep down they were all anti-fascists. However, this version does not stand up to any criticism. Documents show that German physicists worked diligently and conscientiously on the atomic bomb, sometimes even risking their lives during experiments. The Soviet Union also wanted to claim the laurels of being the destroyer of the German nuclear program. The fact is that one of the leading German physicists, Walter Botha, was recruited by Soviet intelligence back in the 1920s, and ironically, he really did play a fatal role in the development of the German atomic bomb. Botha was testing graphite's ability to act as a moderator in a nuclear reactor. After conducting a series of experiments, the scientists concluded that graphite was not suitable for this role. As a result, the Germans had to use the much rarer and less convenient heavy water in their reactors. Later, the scientists' conclusions would be called Botha's mistake, and it really did seriously slow down the German nuclear program. Although in reality there was no mistake at all, the professor simply used graphite that was not pure enough for the experiments. But it's unlikely that this was an act of sabotage on Botha's part. Earlier, French and British physicists had made a similar mistake. And a little later, Soviet scientists led by Kurchatov did the same. In reality, the reasons for the failure are unknown. The situation with the German nuclear project is much more mundane. Neither daring sabotage raids nor the cunning schemes of intelligence agencies had much to do with it. It is often claimed that Hitler was left without an atomic bomb because he expelled all the Jewish physicists from the country, many of whom were top scientists. For example, Albert Einstein himself, who emigrated to the United States after the Nazis came to power. If we look at it globally, the Hitler leadership never fully understood the potential of nuclear weapons, so they did not give it proper attention. And among German scientists, there was no figure who could convey to the leadership the importance of nuclear weapons, so as a result, Hitler's troops were not armed with them. But Hitler was crossed out from the priorities and was supplied on a leftover basis. As an illustration, I can add that 200 times less money was spent on German atomic research. And they involved 1,500 times fewer atomic scientists than in the American Manhattan Project. What would have happened if Hitler had gotten the nuclear bomb? Well, now let's move on to our favorite alternate history. Let's imagine a situation where the Nazis actually got nuclear weapons. How would events have unfolded in this case? I'll say right away, personally I believe that for Germany, a war simultaneously against the gigantic British Empire, the Soviet Union, which Stalin had turned into a massive weapons factory, and the United States, the world's economic leader, was akin to a prolonged suicide. The defeat of the Germans was inevitable. Only some miraculous means, capable of instantly changing all geopolitical alignments, could have saved the Third Reich. And it is precisely nuclear weapons that are best suited for this role. Considering the entire difficulty of the nuclear project, even under the best circumstances, the Germans would not have been able to obtain an atomic bomb before the end of 1943, and most likely only in the first half of 1944. There is no doubt that having such a powerful weapon at their disposal, the Nazis would have immediately put it to use. It should be understood that at the dawn of the atomic era, the nuclear bomb did not yet have such an infernal aura. That appeared much later, during the Cold War period. That is why the Americans, without much hesitation, dropped 2 bombs on Japanese cities. At that time, for the generals, it was simply a new powerful weapon that could be used to effectively destroy the enemy. By the end of 1943, things were far from brilliant for Hitler's forces at the front. The Battle of Kursk had only recently been lost. The Red Army drove the Germans out of the left bank Ukraine, crossed the Dnieper, and liberated Kiev. The Allies landed in Italy, effectively opening a second front in Europe. Strategically, the war was already lost for Germany. However, nuclear weapons could very well have changed the German situation. It is unlikely that Germany's industry could have produced many nuclear warheads at once. Most likely their number would have been just a few. Therefore, the Nazi leadership would undoubtedly have faced the question of choosing targets. The Nazis could not reach the United States. However, they could easily strike the Soviet Union or England. Hitler, despite the fierce war, always had a special attitude toward the English. He considered them to be lost Aryans. That is in fact equal to himself. But for the Nazi leader, Slavs were considered subhumans. They had no right to exist at all. That's why the first nuclear strike would most likely have been carried out on Soviet territory. It's unlikely the Germans would have struck at Red Army units on the front lines. Nuclear weapons aren't very effective against military units. Most likely Hitler would have chosen to strike at major Soviet cities, especially since this could be presented as revenge for the devastating bombings of Germany. Most likely, the primary target of the supposed strike would have been Moscow, the political heart of the Soviet Union with a population of millions. In addition, it is the largest transportation hub and an important economic center. The Germans had bombers capable of delivering a nuclear charge to the Soviet capital. It is possible that the second target for the strike would have been Leningrad. The city is important not only from a military and economic standpoint, but also from an ideological point of view. Undoubtedly, a nuclear strike on Moscow would have been a real shock for the USSR and would have seriously demobilized the troops at the front. It is quite likely that it would have killed the top Soviet leadership, including Stalin himself. The country would seem to be decapitated, which could have led to chaos. After all, the governance of the USSR was always extremely centralized. The further course of events would largely depend on the next leader of the country, his willpower and organizational abilities. Because, I'll repeat once again, it's unlikely that a few not-so-powerful nuclear bombs could seriously undermine the offensive potential of the Red Army. It's quite likely that after the first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, the Nazis would resort to nuclear blackmail against other countries, first and foremost England. It's hard to say whether the British would have had the will to resist if their own cities were under threat of destruction. In real history, they held out under daily bombings and attacks by German V-weapons, but nuclear weapons are a completely different matter. Perhaps the Nazis would have managed to achieve what they wanted most: Britain's withdrawal from the war and the collapse of the Allied coalition. However, we also need to consider another factor, namely the Manhattan Project, which was in full swing in the United States. American territory was out of reach for the Nazis, and the Americans had resources many times greater, if not an order of magnitude more, than the Germans. If Hitler had acquired a nuclear bomb and actually demonstrated its enormous destructive power, it would have only spurred the American project even more. And by 1945, the United States would have had several dozen nuclear weapons in service. Their first and primary targets naturally would have been the cities of Germany, especially since the Americans had no shortage of means to deliver nuclear bombs. With such a turn of events, World War II could have gradually turned into the first nuclear war, with tens of millions of civilian casualties, burned cities, and radiation-contaminated territories in the center of Europe. And yes, the conflict would probably have dragged on for several more years, but the Germans would have lost it anyway, for the same reason: lack of resources. But maybe Hitler had a nuclear bomb. In the early 2000s, a book by German historian Rainer Karlsch called Hitler's Bomb was published, which claimed that the Nazis actually created an atomic bomb by the end of the war and even managed to test it. This East German historian, who spent many years studying the atomic program of the Third Reich, supports this thesis based on previously unknown documents, eyewitness testimonies, and physical analysis of soil samples. Karlsch claims that the test of the Nazi atomic bomb took place in March 1945 in Thuringia. Allegedly, after the war, this issue was seriously investigated by the intelligence service of the GDR, the famous Stasi. There are also other sources confirming that an atomic weapon was tested in Nazi Germany. This, for example, is mentioned in the intelligence report of the 9th US Air Force dated August 19, 1945. However, most experts are skeptical about such sensational claims. They ask the same simple question: if Hitler had a nuclear bomb, why didn't he use it? Obviously, all conspiracy theories can't answer this question. That's why, for example, I'm more inclined to believe the official version of events. Instead of an epilogue, nuclear weapons are the most terrifying means of destruction ever invented by mankind. For almost 80 years now, the whole world has been living under the constant threat of a major nuclear war, which could be humanity's last. Fortunately, nuclear weapons have never fallen into the hands of truly reckless fanatics who would actually be willing to use them. Maybe that's why we're still alive. Even the not-so-rational North Korean dictators have enough sense not to press the red button. But the Nazis would have pressed it, without much hesitation. There's really no doubt about that. They would have lost that war anyway, but then in World War II, several tens of millions more people would probably have died. More.